Chords of Gratitude. The grand piano sat silent in Sarah Venter's studio, its polished surface reflecting the golden hour sunlight that streamed through floor-to-ceiling windows. Blank sheet music scattered across its closed lid, each page as empty as the last 6 months had been. Sarah stood at the window, her fingers unconsciously moving through the motions of playing keys that weren't there, conducting a symphony that refused to come. The New York Philharmonic's deadline loomed 3 weeks away. They wanted her next masterpiece, the follow-up to her acclaimed Symphony of Dawn, but all she had was silence and the echo of screeching tires that hadn't faded since that rainy February night. Her phone buzzed. Another message from Marcus, her agent. The board's asking about progress. Anything to report? Sarah's fingers hovered over the keyboard, then dropped. What could she say? That inspiration had died alongside David in that crash? That she couldn't hear music anymore, only the constant replay of their last conversation about postponing their anniversary dinner so she could finish that commission piece? A street musician's saxophone melody drifted up from Washington Square Park, the notes weaving through her open window. Sarah flinched and shut it firmly. Time was, she would have leaned out to listen, maybe even rushed downstairs to talk shop with a fellow musician. Now, every melody felt like salt in an open wound. The doorbell rang, a sound so unexpected in her self-imposed isolation that she nearly jumped. Through the peephole, she saw Mrs. Chun from apartment 4B, the elderly woman who had lived in the building longer than anyone else. Sarah? I heard you moving around up here. I made too much soup again. Sarah hesitated. Mrs. Chun had been leaving food at her doorstep since the funeral, never pushing, never demanding conversation. Just soup and gentle persistence. I'm working, Mrs. Chun, Sarah called through the door, the lie bitter on her tongue. But thank you. Ah, working. Good. Then you need sustenance, even more. A pause. It's my mother's recipe. The one thing I have left of her, besides memories. Funny how the smallest things can carry the biggest pieces of our heart. No. Something in Mrs. Chen's words made Sarah's hand move to the doorknob. Maybe it was the hint of shared loss in her voice, or maybe it was just that Sarah was tired of the silence that had become her only companion. The door opened to reveal Mrs. Chen's bright smile and a steaming container of soup. Ah, there you are. You know, this soup saved my sanity after Henry passed. Not because it's magical, though my mother would argue that point, but because making it reminded me that I could still create something worthwhile, even when my heart was broken. Sarah accepted the container, its warmth seeping into her cold hands. I didn't know you lost your husband 3 years ago. Cancer. Mrs. Chen's smile turned wistful. He loved music, you know. Used to sit by that window in the lobby every evening, listening to the street performers. Said each one had a story to tell. If only we took the time to listen. A memory stirred. David sang something similar after her first symphony debuted. Every note carries a piece of someone's soul, Sarah. That's why your music touches people. You know how to listen. Mrs. Chun patted her arm. Join me for dinner tomorrow? I'm teaching my granddaughter to make dumplings. She's terrible at it. They all come out looking like sad little clouds. We could use another pair of hands, and maybe some laughter at our attempts. I have a deadline, Sarah said, but the excuse sounded hollow even to her ears. Ah, yes. The symphony everyone's waiting for. Mrs. Chin nodded sagely. You know, when I couldn't paint after Henry died, yes, I used to paint. My art teacher said something I'll never forget. Creation doesn't come from perfection, May. It comes from being willing to make a mess, to fail, to let others see your sad little clouds. She turned to go, then paused. 6 o'clock tomorrow. Apartment 4B. Sometimes the music comes back when we stop trying so hard to hear it. After Mrs. Chin left, Sarah stood in her doorway for a long moment, the soup warm against her chest. Down in the park, the saxophone player had switched to a slower tune, something melancholic but somehow hopeful, like a conversation between loss and healing. For the first time in months, she left her door open to listen. The next evening found Sarah standing outside apartment 4B, her hand raised to knock. The sound of laughter and Mandarin pop music filtered through the door, along with the smell of ginger and green onions. 3 times she'd nearly talked herself out of coming, but each time she'd remembered the saxophone's melody, how it had stayed with her through the night, weaving itself into her dreams. Before she could knock, the door swung open. A teenage girl with purple-streaked hair stood there, flour dusting her black clothes.
Oh.
You must be Mrs. Venter. I'm Lynn. Grandma said you'd come, but she also says I'm going to be a doctor someday, so... She shrugged, grinning. Just Sarah's fine. Sarah managed, thrown by the girl's energy. And you don't want to be a doctor? I want to be a DJ. Come see what we're doing to these poor dumplings. The apartment was smaller than Sarah's, but felt infinitely more alive. Photos covered the walls, wedding pictures, family gatherings, what looked like art gallery openings. Mrs. Chen stood at a flour-dusted table, her skilled hands quickly folding perfect dumplings while Lynn's misshapen attempts sat proudly beside them. Sarah, come. Wash your hands, and I'll show you the secret to making them stick together properly. The next hour passed in a blur of sticky dough, spilled filling, and Lynn's running commentary on everything from her latest mixtape to her grandmother's totally epic love story with her grandfather. Mrs. Chun corrected their technique with patient amusement, sharing stories about learning to make dumplings from her mother in Shanghai. She would be horrified by these, Lynn declared, holding up a particularly lopsided creation. But I bet they'll taste just as good. Better, Mrs. Chun said firmly, because they carry the story of your learning, your laughter. Just like my mother's soup carries her love, even though she's gone. Sarah looked down at her own attempts, not as elegant as Mrs. Chen's, but more stable than Lynn's. My mother tried to teach me to cook once, she found herself saying. It was a disaster. David used to joke that's why he learned to cook, self-preservation. The words slipped out before she could catch them, and for a moment the old grief rose up. But instead of the usual crushing weight, it felt different. Still heavy, but somehow more like a balanced load than a drowning wave. Tell us about him, Lynn asked softly, her usual exuberance gentling. So Sarah did. She told them about David's terrible puns and his habit of humming while he cooked. About how he'd been her first and most honest critic, always encouraging her to dig deeper into her music. He used to say every piece needed 3 things: technique, heart, and gratitude. Gratitude? Lynn asked, crimping another dumpling. For the music itself. For the ability to create it. For the people who would hear it. Sarah's hand stilled. I haven't felt grateful for anything since he died. Mrs. Chen covered Sarah's flour-dusted hands with her own. Gratitude isn't about feeling, dear one. It's about choosing. Every dumpling I make, I choose to be grateful for my mother's patience in teaching me. Every time I miss Henry, I choose to be grateful for the years we had. It doesn't make the loss smaller, but it makes me bigger. Strong enough to carry it. After dinner, Sarah helped with the dishes while Lynn set up her DJ equipment in the living room. Grandma lets me practice here because the neighbors complained about the noise at Mom's place, she explained, adjusting settings on her laptop. Want to hear some things? Before Sarah could respond, the opening notes of a familiar piece filled the room, her own Symphony of Dawn, but transformed. Lynn had woven it into something new, layering in beats and electronic elements that shouldn't have worked but somehow did. I hope you don't mind, Lynn said quickly. Your music it feels like it's having a conversation with something bigger than itself, you know? I wanted to join in. Sarah stood frozen, listening to her compositions speak in a new voice. She could hear what she'd intended when writing it, the gradual awakening, the building hope, but Lynn's additions highlighted something she hadn't consciously included: gratitude. Gratitude for the dawn itself, for the ability to witness it, for the chance to share that wonder with others. It's perfect, she whispered. That night, Sarah sat at her piano for the first time in months. She didn't try to compose. Instead, she played Lynn's remix from memory, her classical training stumbling through the electronic elements, but finding its way. When the piece ended, her fingers stayed on the keys, and a new melody emerged, hesitant at first, then stronger. She reached for the blank sheet music with trembling hands. The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of composition and community. Each evening, she joined Mrs. Chun and Lin for dinner, sharing stories and music. Lin taught her about mixing techniques, while Mrs. Chun shared wisdom wrapped in metaphors about dumplings and painting. Sarah's new symphony took shape, not as the grand statement the Philharmonic probably expected, but as something more intimate, a conversation about loss and healing, about the power of shared meals and shared grief, about the choice to remain open to joy. She called it Chords of Gratitude. The premiere night arrived cool and clear. Sarah stood backstage, hands clasped around a container of Mrs. Chen's soup, waiting for her cue. In the audience, she knew Mrs. Chun and Lin sat with her agent Marcus, who had cried when she finally played him the finished piece. As she stepped onto the conductor's podium, Sarah caught sight of David's empty seat in the front row, the season ticket she couldn't bear to give up. For a moment, grief threatened to overwhelm her. Then she remembered Mrs. Chen's words. Gratitude isn't about feeling. It's about choosing. Sarah raised her baton and chose. The symphony began with a single cello, playing a melody that echoed the saxophone from the park. Other instruments joined gradually, each representing a different kind of gratitude. Violins for memories preserved in soup recipes and shared stories, woodwinds for the patience of teaching and learning, percussion for the courage to make imperfect dumplings and imperfect art. The piece built to what seemed like a climax, then stripped back to a simple piano line, the first notes she'd written that night after hearing Lin's remix. In the final movement, all the elements came together, classical and modern interweaving just as Lin had taught her. The last notes hung in the air like a question and an answer both. What remains when everything changes? Gratitude for what was, gratitude for what is, gratitude for the chance to choose again tomorrow. The silence that followed felt different from the silence of grief. It felt like possibility. Later, after the standing ovation and the critics' praise, after hugs from Mrs. Chun and Lin's excited analysis of the modern elements, Sarah stood alone on the empty stage. She touched the piano keys gently, remembering David's words about music carrying pieces of the soul. "Thank you," she whispered to David, to Mrs. Chun and Lin, to the saxophone player in the park, to every note that had hidden until she was ready to hear it again. Then she picked up her score and headed home, where dumplings and stories waited in apartment 4B. Tomorrow, she would begin a new composition. Tonight, she would practice gratitude in its simplest form, sharing food, sharing music, sharing life. The symphony of everyday grace played on.